In the monsoon-soaked night of Kerala, where the sky wept endlessly and roads gleamed under the shimmer of relentless rain, a government ambulance raced down the winding highway with sirens blaring. Inside, Anjali Menon lay curled on the stretcher, burning with COVID fever, her skin clammy with sweat, and her body trembling from both the illness and confusion. Her breaths were shallow, and consciousness came and went like flickering candlelight in a storm. To Anjali and her worried parents, this ambulance was a lifeline. It was supposed to be her passage to care, to healing, but as the vehicle picked up speed and veered off its expected route, something began to feel wrong. The roads grew narrower, the streetlights faded, and familiar landmarks disappeared into darkness. Then, the GPS went silent. The blue dot on the screen froze. Radio chatter, once constant between hospitals and emergency operators, fizzled into a crackling static. The driver, who had been silent the entire trip, now seemed tense, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, his grip tightening on the wheel. Anjali tried to speak, to ask where they were going, but her voice barely rose above a whisper. Her body ached too much to move. And then the ambulance came to a jarring halt. The vehicle now sat in the middle of a dark, secluded rubber plantation. Trees towered around them, thick with leaves and shadow. There were no homes in sight, no light, no sign of civilization. Just darkness, silence, and the faint rustle of the wind weaving through the forest. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. It was a trap. Welcome to the Crime Series. I am glad to have you join us on another video. Kindly subscribe, like, and share. Let me know where you are watching from. Anjali Menon had always been described as radiant, sharp-minded, and full of warmth. A bright first-year student at a reputable nursing college in Pathanamthitta, Kerala, she had dreams that stretched beyond the borders of her small town. She wanted to serve in a major hospital, perhaps even move abroad one day to further her studies. Her classmates admired her dedication, her teachers praised her potential. She came from a lower middle-class family. Her father, Raghavan Menon, was a retired army clerk who now worked part-time at a local post office to make ends meet. Her mother, Usha, was a homemaker who balanced household duties with caring for her aging mother-in-law and 3 school-age nephews who lived with them. The pandemic turned their modest home into a zone of caution. Anjali rarely stepped outside. Her days were spent in online lectures, assignments, and volunteering virtually through a student-led community outreach group that educated rural families about virus safety protocols. Despite her cautious approach, illness still found her. The earliest symptoms appeared subtly in late August 2020. A mild throat irritation, a scratchy sensation that lingered after long study hours, was brushed aside as nothing more than the result of Kerala's wet season. But then came the fatigue, a low-grade fever. Still manageable, still ignorable. But within days, her Aunt Leela, who lived with them and shared a room with Anjali, also began feeling ill. She developed a persistent cough and chills. The household grew concerned. Given the ongoing pandemic, they decided to act swiftly. On the morning of Saturday, September 3rd, both women made their way to a government COVID-19 testing center. By then, the sun was already intense, and the scene at the facility was grim. A long line of visibly unwell individuals stretched along the street. Many leaned against walls for support, while others sat or lay on the ground, too weak to stand. Healthcare workers, clad in layers of suffocating personal protective equipment, moved slowly through the crowd. It wasn't until 3:45 p.m. that Anjali and Leela were tested. The swab was uncomfortable and harsh, but necessary. The results came later that evening. At precisely 8:17 p.m., the household received confirmation. Both tests were positive. Instructions followed promptly. An ambulance would be arriving shortly to transport them to designated medical facilities. At 9:30 p.m., the vehicle arrived. Clad in full protective suits, the ambulance personnel adhered strictly to protocol. Family members were prohibited from accompanying the patients, regardless of protest or emotional appeals. With no exceptions granted, Anjali and her aunt were escorted into the ambulance alone. The journey to the first hospital proceeded without incident. though the atmosphere inside the ambulance remained tense. Anjali and her aunt, both masked and visibly anxious, sat in silence, holding on to each other for comfort. Upon arrival at the initial COVID facility, Anjali's aunt was escorted out and admitted for treatment. Anjali, however, was informed that she would be transported to the general hospital, located approximately 4 kilometers away. With her aunt now left behind, Anjali found herself alone in the back of the ambulance. The rain continued to fall outside, streaking across the window panes as the vehicle pulled away. The driver, silent and focused, offered no reassurance. The weight of isolation grew heavier with each passing minute. By 10:04 p.m., Anjali checked her phone, reassured by the belief that the second hospital was only minutes away. She focused on calming her breathing, trying to quiet the growing sense of unease. But as the ambulance turned onto unfamiliar roads and began heading away from the town, the situation shifted. Inside the vehicle, the sterile scent of antiseptic mixed with stale perspiration, creating an unsettling atmosphere. The dim, flickering cabin lights revealed the driver's expression, Suresh Nair, whose demeanor had now turned cold and unreadable. His movements became deliberate and invasive. The illusion of safety vanished. Suresh Nair was not new to the road, nor to the passengers who trusted him. Formerly a taxi driver in Kochi, he had once been known for his efficiency and friendliness, but a conviction for driving under the influence had ended his career. With his license revoked, he turned to private ambulance services, where oversight was minimal. No background checks were required. No psychological evaluations, just a commercial driver's permit and availability during a crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic brought the healthcare system to its knees, and in that collapse, opportunity emerged for people like Suresh Nair. With hospitals stretched beyond capacity and a shortage of licensed drivers, private ambulance services became a revolving door for underqualified personnel. Background checks were rare. Psychological screenings were non-existent. If a candidate had a commercial driver's permit and could report to work, they were often hired without question. For Suresh, it was the perfect cover. He quickly adopted the mannerisms that put others at ease: quiet, compliant, hopeful. He was the kind of driver who offered water to anxious relatives and shared light-hearted jokes with nurses during transfers. He earned trust through performance. But beneath the professional veneer was a simmering pathology, one fed by unmonitored access to the vulnerable and unchecked control over routes, timing, and procedures. The job gave him more than income. It gave him power. Most never questioned if a detour was necessary. Most never suspected what could happen in the back of an ambulance when a patient was alone, sick, and helpless. That night, with Anjali Menon as his only passenger, Suresh turned off the GPS and navigated toward an unlit stretch of rubber plantation. The engine idled in the shadows, rain drumming on the metal roof. Then, at some point, he made his move. The physical partition that usually separated the front and rear of the ambulance had been unlocked, perhaps tampered with earlier. Suresh climbed into the back compartment, now isolated from any watchful eyes. Anjali, weak from fever and barely able to sit upright, registered the shift too late. Her mind struggled to process what was happening. At first, she believed he had come to check on her, perhaps to adjust her oxygen line or reposition her stretcher. But his body language was off. His silence, the sudden change in atmosphere, and the way he loomed over her set off alarm bells. Her instincts screamed before her body could react. She realized, in a flood of panic, that she wasn't being transported to safety. She tried to resist. Her arms flailed, her hands clawed at his skin. Her nails dug into his forearm with what strength she could muster, drawing blood. But her condition worked against her. The fever blurred her vision, slowed her reflexes, and drained her strength. Her gasps became shallow, ragged, and ineffective. Pinned to the stretcher by the weight of a man meant to save lives, her thoughts grew frantic. There was no one to call out to. The nearest town was kilometers away. Her phone, her lifeline, was out of reach, and with each second, her hope diminished. This wasn't an opportunistic assault. It was routine, calculated, practiced, and now it was happening to her. If you found this story compelling and appreciate the way we bring real-life cases to you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue to uncover the truth and share these important stories. Like, share, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. As the attack continued, a chilling realization began to take shape. This was not spontaneous. The disabled GPS, the calculated detour, and the driver's composed demeanor all pointed to something far more premeditated. This was not a first-time offense. It was part of a pattern. When the assault ended, the perpetrator moved with an eerie calm. He reached for a discarded medical rag to wipe himself down, his breathing irregular. His expression briefly betrayed a flicker of emotion, something between regret and detachment, before it returned to indifference. He glanced back at Anjali, calculating, as if weighing the consequences. For Anjali, there were no words, only silence. But in that silence, she took mental inventory. Every distinguishing feature was committed to memory. She was preparing not to forget, but to expose. Because she would tell. And when she did, she would make sure no one ever doubted her. As the driver repositioned himself and prepared to restart the vehicle, his elbow knocked into a tray, dislodging a used syringe. It hit the floor and rolled near her stretcher. Even through blurred vision, Anjali recognized its significance. The faint odor of alcohol on the rubber stopper suggested recent use, likely a stimulant, taken to suppress nerves before the attack. She reached for it with trembling fingers, concealing it beneath her sleeve. It wasn't for retaliation. It was for evidence. As the ambulance doors opened at General Hospital's emergency bay, a harsh flood of fluorescent light spilled into the vehicle, momentarily blinding Anjali Menon. The stark contrast between the sterile brightness of the hospital and the rain-soaked darkness of the plantation road caused her to flinch. Her body, still trembling from the trauma and gripped by fever, recoiled from the environment that should have brought relief. The familiar hospital scents of antiseptic and bleach, symbols of safety and control, now triggered waves of nausea. Inside the emergency unit, amidst the usual hum of controlled urgency, Nurse Latha Nair stood at the center of it all. At 47, with over 2 decades of experience, 5 of those years in the sexual assault forensic unit, she had developed an exceptional ability to read the subtle cues of distress. Her eyes, seasoned and sharp, quickly scanned the incoming patient. Anjali's trembling hands on the stretcher rails, her tightly clenched legs, her pallor, her silence. Latha recognized the signs immediately. Meanwhile, Suresh Nair had already slipped back into his public persona. As the stretcher was lowered, he played the part flawlessly, presenting the patient as a young COVID-positive female displaying symptoms of delirium. Patient became combative during transport, had to sedate her for safety. His tone was laced with professional concern. His gestures were measured, calm. But the inconsistencies were glaring to a trained eye. Nurse Latha immediately noted the small but unmistakable bulge beneath his sleeve, evidence of a recent injection. COVID ambulances were not stocked with sedatives, and certainly not the kind that would leave marks on the driver. She had encountered such scenarios before. Assailants who used stimulants to suppress their nerves post-assault, later passing them off as patient management measures. Anjali's reaction was involuntary. Her body tensed at the falsehood. And though she attempted to speak, her throat, ravaged by illness and silence, produced only a weak, fractured sound. Her eyes blurred, her head swimming as hospital orderlies transferred her from the stretcher. Their touch was clinical, unknowing. Assessing the situation, Nurse Latha stepped forward with precision. She intervened without hesitation, redirecting the driver away from the patient and toward administrative procedures, ensuring immediate separation. Her tone made clear that further proximity would not be tolerated. "Driver, the doctor needs your paperwork at the front desk." Her tone brooked no argument. As Suresh hesitated, she added with deliberate emphasis, "Now." In that moment, the quiet gears of institutional protection began to turn. And for the first time that night, Anjali was no longer alone. Once the driver was out of earshot, Nurse Latha Nair began her covert assessment under the guise of adjusting Anjali's IV line. With years of experience in trauma and forensic care, she didn't need to ask what had happened. The signs were unmistakable. The neckline of Anjali's kurta was torn, not in a manner that suggested random movement, but with force. Its fabric separated along defined, deliberate lines. Her palms bore crescent-shaped nail marks, a result of clenching her fists in desperation. Fingerprint-shaped bruises were beginning to appear on her wrists, indicating restraint. The physical evidence was clear. Bending closer as if to check vitals, Latha lowered her voice. She whispered in Malayalam, "Blink once if that man hurt you." Anjali's eyelids shut tightly, then flew open. Tears surged down her cheeks as her dry, cracked lips moved silently, forming the word, "yes." At that moment, a metallic clink interrupted the sterile hum of the ER. A used syringe, hidden in her sleeve, tumbled to the floor, its needles still coated in residue. It had been Suresh's, taken in the aftermath of the assault. Latha moved with precision. Her foot discreetly swept the syringe toward the crash cart. Without breaking stride, she issued a quiet command to a nearby junior nurse. 2 orderlies were quietly repositioned near the ambulance bay exit, a standard precaution in response to a potential security breach. Their presence was deliberate and unobtrusive. When Suresh Nair re-entered the emergency unit, the dynamic of the room had shifted. Nurse Latha Nair presented the used syringe, now secured in her gloved hand. Calm and composed, she pointed out a critical inconsistency. COVID ambulances were not authorized to carry sedatives, and certainly not injectables of the type indicated by the needle. A fresh injection mark on Suresh's forearm further contradicted his earlier claims about patient management. Hospital security responded with swift coordination. Guards emerged from designated positions. A police officer took control, restraining Suresh near the ambulance. The arrest was carried out without resistance. The evidence was mounting. The syringe, now collected and sealed, would later test positive for a stimulant not authorized for medical transport staff. GPS data retrieved from the ambulance confirmed a 17-minute detour from the expected hospital route, an unexplained deviation that aligned with the victim's account. As officers escorted the suspect away, his demeanor reflected not remorse, but disbelief. The narrative he had carefully maintained, trusted medic, emergency responder, community asset, had unraveled at the hands of a young patient he had underestimated. In the background, Nurse Latha remained with Anjali Menon, whose condition remained critical but stable. Initial safety had been secured. But for the investigation team, for medical staff, and especially for the victim, this was only the beginning. Inside the isolation ward at General Hospital, Anjali Menon remained under close medical supervision. The fluorescent lights overhead emitted a constant hum, casting a cold, sterile glow over the room. Her condition was stable but complicated by multiple layers of trauma, physical, psychological, and emotional. She lay still, showing minimal movement. Medical staff documented signs of both viral infection and physical assault. The pain from the virus combined with injuries sustained during the attack, creating a complex clinical picture. Observers noted her restraint, her visible effort to maintain composure despite overwhelming distress. Outside the ward's reinforced glass window, heavy monsoon rain blurred the landscape in muted tones of gray. The atmosphere reflected the emotional toll of recent events, both inside and beyond the hospital walls. Within the room, Nurse Latha Nair continued her duties with methodical precision. Years of experience in emergency care and trauma response had taught her to recognize patterns. Every flinch, every pause in breathing, every involuntary muscle twitch was carefully noted. Her focus remained on monitoring Anjali's condition, both to stabilize the patient and to preserve potential evidence of the crime. The scene inside the ward marked a critical transition, from immediate crisis response to long-term medical and forensic care. The investigation had begun. The survivor was no longer in danger, but the impact of what had occurred would continue to unfold. With Suresh Nair in custody, the investigation began to unfold, methodically, deliberately, and with increasing weight. What started with a single syringe soon escalated into a broader inquiry that revealed a disturbing pattern of predation. The syringe Anjali Menon had hidden during transport proved to be more than a medical artifact. Forensic testing identified not only traces of a stimulant commonly used to suppress anxiety, but also a partial fingerprint on the plunger. That print did not match Anjali or any hospital staff, further implicating the driver in unauthorized use and establishing a forensic link to the crime. As investigators dug deeper, archived complaints emerged from the ambulance company's records. 3 separate cases involving young female COVID patients had previously been reported, but dismissed at the time as stress-induced delusions. None had been formally investigated. One case, in particular, drew immediate attention. A 22-year-old medical student who had died 6 months earlier after leaping from a moving ambulance in Kodam district. Her death had been labeled an accident. The case was closed within 48 hours. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Rajan, a night dispatcher at the ambulance company and longtime employee, contacted authorities after seeing Anjali's case on the evening news. In a formal statement, he described how Suresh had routinely requested late-night shifts involving young female patients. Rajan noted instances where Suresh returned with disheveled clothing and the distinct smell of alcohol. At the time, his concerns were ignored. The workload during the pandemic had left little room for questions. As the investigation progressed, additional witnesses stepped forward. A junior nurse from Thiruvalla Government Hospital recalled Suresh's repeated presence near the women's ward without legitimate purpose. A petrol station employee provided surveillance footage showing Suresh purchasing liquor on duty. And the most damning evidence came from the mother of the deceased medical student. She presented her daughter's personal diary. Entries within it described a nearly identical encounter involving an ambulance driver who reeked of alcohol and made inappropriate advances. The case soon gained national attention. In court, the prosecution presented a compelling sequence of evidence. Anjali's testimony was clear and unwavering. Despite her fever, she recounted the events with clarity. The defense attempted to discredit her, suggesting her account may have been fever-induced hallucination. That argument quickly collapsed. Forensic photographs showed scratches on the interior walls of the ambulance, consistent with defensive actions. Strands of Anjali's hair were found caught in stretcher hinges. Blood traces matched the injury she inflicted while biting her attacker's hand. The turning point came when 2 additional victims were allowed to testify. Until that moment, they had remained silent, bound by fear and stigma. Their stories were nearly identical. Unplanned detours, remote locations, intimidation, and manipulation. One victim broke down while recounting how she was ordered to sanitize herself after the assault, a tactic used to eliminate physical evidence, consistent with Anjali's report. With these testimonies, the scope of Suresh Nair's actions became undeniable. What began as a single case of assault now revealed a calculated abuse of authority during a public health crisis, one that had been hidden in plain sight, enabled by systemic oversight failures and the chaotic backdrop of the pandemic. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was silent, packed with journalists, legal observers, women's rights advocates, and survivors. All eyes were on the bench as the presiding judge, a senior justice known for his unshakable adherence to both law and conscience, delivered the long-awaited verdict. His voice, steady and firm, cut through the tension in the room. One by one, he listed the charges: aggravated sexual assault, abuse of authority, criminal intimidation, evidence tampering, and obstruction of emergency care. Each count was backed by forensic findings, witness testimony, and a timeline of events that pointed to deliberate and repeated predatory behavior. The sentence handed down was unprecedented for a sexual assault case in the state: 25 years in prison without parole. The judge made clear that this was not a case of situational misconduct, nor a momentary lapse in moral judgment. It was, in his words, a calculated exploitation of pandemic chaos carried out under the guise of medical service, a betrayal not only of a patient's trust, but of society's trust in those sworn to protect and transport its most vulnerable. He described the attack as an act of systemic betrayal, citing the deliberate nature of the route deviation, the manipulation of institutional loopholes, and the use of a medical transport vehicle as the scene of the crime. The sentence was not only punitive, it was symbolic, intended to set a precedent. As Suresh Nair was led away in handcuffs, the man who once wore a facade of public service now showed no sign of composure. His expression had shifted from calculated confidence to stunned resignation. The courtroom doors closed behind him. Justice, at least in legal terms, had been served. Inside, Anjali Menon sat quietly, surrounded by legal advocates and healthcare workers who had stood by her. She exhaled, just once, a shaky breath, the kind that marks the end of survival and the beginning of recovery. The road ahead would not be easy. Trauma does not dissolve with a verdict. For Anjali, healing would involve confronting recurring nightmares, panic attacks triggered by ambulance sirens, and the social scrutiny that often trails survivors. But for the first time since the assault, there was space for something new, the fragile stirrings of peace. Outside the courthouse, a circle had formed around her. Nurses, fellow survivors, women's rights activists, and the grieving mothers of other victims gathered in quiet solidarity. Anjali looked up at the sky. The same monsoon clouds that had shadowed her during that horrific night now hung heavy above, but they no longer carried the same weight. The rains would return, but so would the light. And this time, she would meet it head-on. Medically, her condition had stabilized weeks earlier. The virus that once ravaged her body had finally retreated after nearly a month in isolation. But the emotional toll remained. Returning home marked a new phase, one filled with paradoxes. The world around her looked the same. The lush green of Kerala's trees, the noise of vendors, the warmth of her mother's embrace. But everything felt different. Familiar sensations now came with new triggers. Ambulance sirens at night would jolt her awake, drenched in sweat, her hospital-issued pulse oximeter beeping as panic overtook her breathing. Crowds made her anxious. Silence made her hyper-aware. The attack was over. The case was closed. But the journey to reclaim her sense of normalcy, her voice, her body, her place in the world, was just beginning. In the months following the verdict, Anjali Menon began the long, personal work of healing. The virus had left her body, but the trauma it carried had rooted itself deep within. While Anjali slowly rebuilt her life, the man who had torn it apart faced a different kind of reckoning behind the walls of Pujapura Central Prison. Suresh Nair's fall from perceived hero to convicted predator was absolute. Once known as a reliable emergency driver, he became a pariah among inmates, many of whom had daughters the same age as his victim. The consequences were not just legal, but social. He endured isolation, harassment, and constant reminders of his crimes through whispers and chants that followed him through the prison yard. His physical appearance deteriorated, his once bulky frame thinned, his hair streaked with premature gray. At home, the collapse was equally severe. His wife, Lakshmi, initially stood by him during the early phases of the investigation. But the trial, the headlines, and eventually a question from their youngest daughter, "Why does Appa make girls disappear in ambulances?" was the breaking point. She filed for divorce, returned to her maiden name, and relocated their children to her ancestral village under a new identity. But the most far-reaching consequences played out far beyond the home and prison. The political fallout was swift and wide-ranging. As media coverage intensified, the public demanded accountability. Not just from the ambulance service, but from the government agencies that had allowed such oversight gaps to exist. The incident became a political flashpoint in Kerala's ongoing battle over healthcare integrity and women's safety. While the ruling party acted quickly to implement reforms, opposition leaders seized the moment. They criticized years of regulatory neglect and accused the government of enabling a system where predators could operate unchecked. Press conferences turned into platforms for political blame. Suresh Nair's case was referenced repeatedly, not just as a personal crime, but as a symbol of institutional failure. In response, the Kerala government enacted a sweeping set of reforms, now known as the Anjali Protocol. The measures were designed to restore public trust and protect future patients. Key components included tamper-proof GPS tracking on all ambulances, with real-time feeds monitored by centralized control rooms, 360-degree surveillance using dual-facing dashcams, capturing footage from both the driver's cabin and patient area, uploaded to secure cloud servers, mandatory female attendance on all female patient transports, along with panic buttons directly linked to local police stations. A driver vetting system requiring rigorous background checks and psychological screening for all emergency transport personnel. The impact was immediate. In just 1 year, reports of sexual assault in medical transport dropped by 63%. Emergency response times improved by 22% through optimized routing and monitoring. Applications from women seeking training and employment in ambulance services tripled, aided by new government scholarships targeting female paramedics and transport assistants. Anjali, now 24, channels her recovery into advocacy. She leads an initiative, a survivor-led support network, providing legal, medical, and psychological assistance to victims of gender-based violence. More than 3,000 survivors have accessed services through the program. Her office is modest. The accolades and awards she's received line one wall, but her most treasured display sits beneath a mural in the hallway of the hospital where her nightmare began. A mural depicting transformation through resilience. Beneath it, she keeps a glass case filled with handwritten notes from young nursing students, each message a testament to her impact. Some simply say, "Because of you, I reported him." Others, "You made me believe I could heal." Her voice is not the loudest in the room, but in the quiet corridors of change, it is among the most powerful. Anjali Menon's story did not end with a verdict. It began there. And it continues every time another survivor steps forward, no longer alone. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or opened your eyes, subscribe to our channel for more real-life crime documentaries and fictional stories inspired by true events. We uncover the darkest corners of human nature, so you can be more aware, more informed, and maybe even safer. Until next time, stay sharp, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something just isn't right.
A 19-year-old COVID-19 patient was in an ambulance by its driver on Saturday night at Aranyala in Kerala's Pathanamthitta district. The accused, identified as Nufal, 29, was arrested from the premises of Adoor General Hospital at Panikkachirayil in Kayamkulam South early on Sunday. The culprit had threatened the girl not to tell anyone about the incident, said an officer at Adoor police station, where the case is registered. The incident took place when the ambulance was taking the patient from Kojancherry on the way to Pandalam. A 42-year-old housewife, a native of India, and the 19-year-old girl had tested positive for COVID-19. They arrived at Adoor Hospital on Saturday evening, but there were no vacant beds. Therefore, the young girl was directed to the COVID-19 First Line Treatment Center, CFLTC, at Pandalam, while the elder woman was directed for shifting to Kojancherry District Hospital. The driver had to reach Kojancherry via Thumpaman instead of the Kalanada-Aranyala route. The second route is a shorter and easy way to reach Kojancherry. The girl could have been dropped off at Pandalam first if the ambulance had gone through the MC road, police said. Instead, the driver dropped the 42-year-old woman first at the Kojancherry District Hospital around 1 a.m. on Sunday. After that, he drove the ambulance via Aranyala. Police said he parked the ambulance on the way toward the airport project in Aranyala. The girl was forcibly tortured after opening the back door of the ambulance. The driver removed his own PPE kit while committing the crime, police said. Then he dropped off the girl at Pandalam and went to Adoor General Hospital by ambulance. The girl reported the incident to health workers at the First Line Treatment Center in Pandalam. Following this, the information was handed over to the Pandalam police. According to Pandalam police, the Adoor SI arrested the accused on Sunday morning. As the incident took place in Aranyala, the case will be handed over to Aranyala police later.